It's a wild world out there, but some worlds are even wilder. Hi, my name is Tyler Hapney, and you're listening to Dungeons and Dystopias. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome to yet another episode of Dungeons and Dystopias. I am your host and game master, Tyler Hapney. I have run well over 300 games of Cyberpunk Red and Dungeons and Dragons combined, and this podcast is a way for me to reconcile my thoughts on some of the happenings within both fandoms, and maybe some of the news, maybe going over some lore, fun stuff like that. But today we're actually going to be looking more towards the news side of things. I know last time we talked about D&D, we were also kind of looking at news and reviewing the most recent sort of unearthed arcana they released in the Scion. But today we're going to go back to the news because there's actually been a few pretty major developments within the D&D fandom that happened just within the last few days. And also, I think this would probably be a good episode to address Critical Role's new stuff, Derrington Press, their Daggerheart competitor, and all this other stuff that's sort of going on in the D&D space. So it's a little bit less talking about the setting and the rules and mechanics, but more just reflecting over what's kind of been going on, because it seems to me, at least at Dungeons and Dragons, at Wizards of the Coast, there's a serious shakeup happening. And that could be potentially pretty rough, if you ask me. So I guess kind of let's go into it with the sort of the bigger news. Two of the major heads at Dungeons and Dragons, especially when it comes to writing and creating and heading a lot of these sort of modules, especially some of the bigger ones that were more popular during 5e. But we have Jeremy Crawford and Chris Perkins, two of, I'd say, the most important people when it comes to story design and module design at Dungeons & Dragons, have both left the company and have now signed on with Critical Role, their sort of TTRPG company, and what they're creating in a system called Daggerheart. Now, before we get into anything, just gotta let you know, I really don't know anything about Daggerheart. I have not looked at the rules or how it's played. I haven't even watched any of the one-shots or anything that's been hosted yet. So when it comes to Daggerheart, I'm not too knowledgeable. That is something I will need to be getting into. I've been hearing so much about it. And guaranteed I will wind up reading that rule book by the end of the year. But for now, I'm still a little unsure as to what the mechanical differences between Daggerheart and Dungeons & Dragons are, other than that it is obviously being developed by Critical Role, and I've been seeing a lot of discussion in the community that Daggerheart could potentially be another competitor for Dungeons & Dragons, which just that statement alone, I think it's hard to quantify that. Dungeons & Dragons has been the de facto head of the tabletop role-playing game genre ever since it was created. It's hard to say something is going to be competing against D&D when nothing has really even come close. I guess the only thing we can talk about in that sense is maybe Pathfinder, which is based off of Dungeons & Dragons 3.5e, but still, I think if you compare the numbers between Pathfinder and Dungeons & Dragons, it's still not even close. So really, to hear people talking about Daggerheart like this makes me think, okay, well, some of these people are maybe a little upset with Wizards of the Coast for what Wizards of the Coast has done over the past few years. Especially with the OGL crisis, a lot of what they've been doing with 5.5e AI art. They sent the Pinkertons to a guy's house because he got his hands on some magic cards early. Just stuff like that And a lot of that is also, I mean, people are theorizing that might be why Chris Perkins and Jeremy Crawford left, especially over that whole OGL scandal, which really put the Wizards of the Coast in a bad light in the D&D community. So a lot of that's just been kind of compounding, and some people think that might be why these two incredibly important figures from Wizards of the Coast have jumped ship and are now making their way over towards what can be seen as a direct competitor to Wizards of the Coast, which is, I mean, obviously, seeing it happen so quickly implies to me that there was obviously a lot going on behind the scenes. And it's likely that this wasn't an easy decision for either person, but the fact that they both went and the fact that it was so sudden tells me that this was probably not an instance where they're leaving Wizards of the Coast in necessarily amazing terms. You know what I mean? Because when you look at it, some of these people, I mean, Chris Perkins, he's been working for Wizards of the Coast since the late 90s. And to have him leave so suddenly for a competitor of all things is telling. And the same goes for Jeremy Crawford, who joined on the team for Wizards of the Coast, I think maybe a little later, towards 4th edition. But still, he's become a very important figure within the D20 sort of, or the D&D community for rulings and all this other stuff. So to see that happen is interesting. And as I understand it, they aren't the only people as Wizards of the Coast who has left Dungeons and Dragons, which is concerning because obviously those two leaving is really good. Well, not really good. It's really obviously concerning. But we've also have the Dungeons and Dragons VP Jess Lanzillo leaving as well. So that is 3 major contributors to Dungeons and Dragons and Wizards of the Coast that have jumped ship, essentially. And that, I mean, having Chris Perkins and Jeremy Crawford both leaving, they had a lot of impact on a lot of 5e, and I don't know about too much going into 5.5e, but at the very least, having that amount of impact and sway, we can expect to see some very different kind of, I guess, feelings, some different vibes coming from the upcoming 5.5e books as people try to compensate for these known voices leaving the company so easily. And, you know, that might even go into making better sort of Daggerheart in a sense, because now everyone's going to be looking towards Critical Role to see if and when they do their full Daggerheart campaign. I mean, they've been playing Dungeons and Dragons for 3 whole campaigns now, and one of their campaigns is a show with multiple seasons. So it's only reasonable to assume that Critical Role after the OGL crisis, which is why this whole Daggerheart thing even exists. It is unfathomable how terrible of a decision that OGL tweak they tried to do was. Really. Like, it is just, it's caused so many problems for Wizards of the Coast that there is no conceivable way in which that decision was worth it, at least in my eyes. I don't know. I don't have access to the accounting books or whatever. You get what I mean. But I think with Chris Perkins and Jeremy Crawford both being at this new company, that they might be able to get them on board for helping to maybe write some of these Daggerheart campaigns, or maybe even go and look at working on the next main Critical Role campaign. Because I'm assuming at this point Matt Mercer probably doesn't prepare it all himself. I mean, there's a lot going on there, and obviously they need to design. I mean, they're going to design a Daggerheart module for Exandria. I mean, that feels like something that is like a no-brainer, but you never know. Yeah, you know, I can't see the future. I don't work for Derrington Press. I don't work for Critical Role. I don't, you know, I these are just theories, but it seems to me like something that should happen. So that's what's going on right now with Derrington Press, Daggerheart, Wizards of the Coast, all of that business. just a whole lot of crazy stuff happening over at Wizards of the Coast. This has been in the news for over the last few days. By this point, it's been all over the place when it comes to this. I mean, they're leaving for a competitor. Like that is it's not exactly rare to see people leave a company and then join a competitor, but for people who are that much in the public eye and would likely know what that implies for Wizards of the Coast's team and their design, well, I mean, it gives off that impression that Wizards of the Coast is not a great place to work. And I mean, saying that is rough, but I mean, we kind of already knew that. If you look at Baldur's Gate 3, uh, they had a cash cow with Baldur's Gate 3. Larian made almost the perfect game. Just using D&D and those rules, and they showed that it is extremely possible to make a well-selling game based off of those rules. Obviously, the budget was super high, but it sold back like so much more than what the budget was. But even with that in mind, Larian refused to do any DLC or even consider another Baldur's Gate game because their experience with Wizards of the Coast was so bad. You have to understand that's turning down free money because the experience was so rough because they weren't able to work with the team they wanted to. The story with that is, as I understand it, Wizards of the Coast basically fired half the people that Larian was working with through that whole thing. And it made the whole, I'm assuming it just made the whole process that much more difficult because now they have to deal with these new people and I mean, all these people that they were building rapport with and talking to, they're just gone. Like, no company that wants to make a decent product is going to fire all of the people who are currently in charge of making that product decent unless there's a serious problem going on with management. And that seems to be the impression that a lot of people have been giving for Wizards of the Coast. Obviously, I don't work with Wizards of the Coast. I've only heard stories through the grapevine. But from what I have heard, right now, there is a reason a lot of big-name gaming companies aren't pumping out D&D titles. It's just because Wizards of the Coast is, they're run by Hasbro. They're run by a publicly owned company that needs to make money for shareholders, and they need to do infinite growth, which is hard to do for a tabletop role-playing game. It's not exactly a growing market that's exploding all the time. The last time we actually had TTRPGs come to the forefront was during COVID, which is over now. So people are going back to their normal jobs, and we're just back into where we were before with maybe, a little bit more attention on this stuff, but I wouldn't say it's significant enough to rely on Wizards of the Coast being able to make more and more money each quarter off of 5.5e, which is an addition most people aren't really, I feel like most people are kind of just sticking with 5e, to be honest with you. So, sorry to turn this into a rant about Wizards of the Coast, but I mean, this news it's important for the hobby because we're about to see, I believe, a fundamental shift in the tone and stylings and maybe even the rulings taking place within 5.5e. Not to say that everything hinged upon these two guys, Chris Perkins and Jeremy Crawford, but they were some of the more well-recognized voices within the fandom, within the community, and now they're gone. From Wizards of the Coast. A lot of the people who people knew from Wizards of the Coast over the last few years have been removed. And this feels like almost the end of an era, having all of these people over the past 5 or so years leaving and going elsewhere. So now we're kind of just sort of sitting here waiting to see what happens with Wizards of the Coast, what the quality of their modules are. Like I said, we haven't even really gotten any campaigns for 5.5e, just maybe one-shots, modules, stuff like that. We have, I think, the Tales from the Infinite Staircase, but that's I struggle to call that a campaign. It's a collection of missions. So yeah, if you're interested in Dungeons and Dragons, please do keep an eye on the quality of writing going forward, and hopefully, we will see maybe even an improvement in Wizards of the Coast. But judging by how things have been going recently, I am unfortunately not entirely too confident in that being the case. So we're gonna end this bummer of an episode off with a monster of the week. I figure I should do something maybe a little lighthearted, maybe a little fun, to kind of balance out the news of all of this, change going on within Dungeons and Dragons. So I think today I'd like to kind of go over one of the more interesting creatures, and that would be the Nilbog. So for any of my players who might be listening, they probably felt a Vietnam flashback hit them the moment I mentioned the word Nilbog, because when I first started Dungeons and Dragons, I was just an amateur DM. I still am, but I didn't have a podcast back then. And I would, I think the Nilbog was really the first enemy I set up against them that people memorized. They remembered the Nilbog. That was an experience that we still reference to this day. It's just one of those things. I had him show up and he said some funny lines and it wasn't expected, and then it wound up being that the Nilbog was a recurring character that would just keep reappearing over and over again. Because really, let me just describe the Nilbog real quick. He is meant to be, or it is meant to be, the most annoying, insufferable creature for your party to fight. In order to actually hurt the Nilbog, they would need to initially pass a charisma save. If they fail, they must instead spend their turn praising the Nilbog. The Nilbog itself doesn't have too many damaging capabilities. It has Vicious Mockery and a stick it can hit people with, but all of its other spells are like Tasha's Hideous Laughter, Hold Person, stuff like that. They're all control spells made to elongate the suffering of the party, who is, of course, exposed to the Nilbog, which is goblin spelled backwards. But the Nilbog also has an ability where when he takes damage, he can instead choose not to take damage and instead be healed for like 2d8. Which is great. That's just a reaction he has. So even if one of your players is able to beat that charisma save and attack the Nilbog, there's still a pretty good chance they won't do anything. And he can just cast Tasha's on them and make them go crazy. So it's just a creature placed in there, made to torment your players, to elongate an encounter by just having this thing prancing around, casting control spells, and most likely insulting your party while they're trying to maybe take care of another group of goblins. And then they've got the Nilbog roasting them the whole time. Just an insane creature to throw in anywhere. And of course, me being a fresh DM decided that the Nilbog was interesting enough that he could keep appearing over and over again. And that was very easy to do. The Nilbog has an ability where this is how bad the Nilbog is. The Nilbog has an ability where when he dies, if he dies, the Nilbog is a trickster spirit. It's not necessarily the goblin. It's a spirit possessing the goblin. So when the goblin's body dies, the spirit leaves and goes to the nearest goblin. Think about that. So you're not technically fighting one goblin. You're fighting a trickster spirit that is piloting all of these goblins like a puppet. And if you're fighting a bunch of goblins and you kill the Nilbog, well, you're just going to have another Nilbog in your hands. So it's really just a mess. A mess of a creature. And honestly, I think a really funny curveball to throw at your party if maybe they're like level 3 or 4 and they've been fighting goblins for a few levels, and they're like, all right, maybe we're starting to get out of these goblins. Well, throw them a curveball, throw them a Nilbog, see how they take it. And I think it'd be probably a pretty fun time. So that'll be it for us this week. Thank you so much for listening. Please tune in next week where we talk a little bit about Cyberpunk Red. Other than that, thank you so much for listening. My name has been Tyler Hapney, and this has been Dungeons and Dystopias.